History is a gallery of monuments. We look at the statues and we recite the names. Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, John Brown. Their stories are carved into the very foundation of the American narrative. They are the voices we hear echoing through the centuries.
But look closer at the edges of those portraits. Look at the shadows cast behind the pedestals.
History is not just a collection of generals and icons. It is a vast, silent machinery of men whose names have been scrubbed from the ledgers of time. They were the ones who moved in the dark, who carried the messages, who held the lines, and who died in obscurity. We celebrate the leaders, yet we overlook the participants who made the movement possible.
There is one name in particular that remains buried, a name that history almost let slip through its fingers.
He was there at the center of the most volatile moment in the 19th century. He was there when the fire started. Yet, for generations, he remained a ghost. It is time to step out of the light and into the shadows to find the man who survived where others fell. The man in the shadows was Osborne Perry Anderson. He was not a bystander.
He was a participant at the very heart of the raid on Harper's Ferry.
When the smoke cleared and the dust settled over the blood-soaked arsenal, the movement had been shattered. His brothers in arms were dead, executed, or imprisoned. The history books were written by those who stood outside the fray.
Yet Anderson was inside. He was the only black man to walk away from that raid alive.
While others were silenced by the state or lost to the passage of time,
Anderson possessed a rare, dangerous clarity. He was the witness who saw the end of the insurrection from the inside.
He carried the burden of the fallen, the weight of their failed revolution, and the singular truth of their final hours.
He was not just a survivor. He was the primary source. By remaining alive, he ensured the narrative would not be rewritten by the victors.
He walked out of the fire with the truth in his hands,
ready to hold the pen that would define his legacy and the struggle of his comrades forever. Years before the raid, Anderson was born into a Pennsylvania that promised liberty but delivered only uncertainty. In the 1830s, the boundary between free soil and slave territory felt like a thin,
fraying thread. He grew up learning that safety was not a right, but a temporary state of grace.
He watched the streets of his childhood carefully. Every stranger was a potential hazard.
Every local official held the power to disrupt a life with a single piece of paper.
The legal landscape began to shift, and the North transformed into a hunting ground for those seeking to profit from human misery.
Anderson felt the walls closing in.
He moved through his days with the constant, prickling sensation of being watched. There was no true sanctuary, only degrees of risk. He learned to read the signs of an approaching threat before the danger even arrived. It was a life lived on the edge of a blade, where a single wrong turn or a misplaced word could lead to chains. He navigated this fractured reality, sharpening his awareness of the world around him, waiting for the moment when he would no longer be forced to run. Anderson found his purpose not in the field, but at the press. He mastered the trade of a printer, spending his days in the rhythmic clatter of metal type and heavy ink. He learned the weight of a lead letter and the permanence of a pressed page. To others, it was merely labor, but to Anderson, the press was an arsenal. Every pamphlet he set, every newspaper column he pulled from the machine, became a strike against the institution of slavery. He watched the ink stain his fingers, a constant reminder of the work that had to be done. He realized that words could travel where his body could not, crossing borders and reaching minds that had been closed to the reality of the struggle. He began to draft his own arguments, refining his prose with the precision of a blade. The shop became his command post. He was no longer just a printer. He was an intellectual warrior, arming the public with the truth. Each sheet of paper printed was a disruption to the silence. He understood that while chains held the body, the right words could shatter the foundations of the system that forged them. He was preparing for a war of ideas, one that would eventually demand more than just ink.
The passage of the Fugitive Slave Act shattered the illusion of Northern safety. Suddenly,
The law itself became a weapon directed at those who had once been beyond the reach of the slaveholders.
The streets he had walked for years transformed into a hunting ground. Bounty hunters appeared in town squares,
their eyes scanning faces with cold, predatory intent. Anderson watched from his shop as neighbors were seized in broad daylight,
dragged away by men empowered by federal authority. The risk of capture grew with every sunrise. He realized his printing press, once a source of strength, had become a beacon for his enemies. To stay was to invite the chains he had spent his life resisting. He packed only what he could carry,
leaving behind the heavy iron type and the stacks of paper that had been his life's work. The decision was not made in anger, but in the cold calculation of survival. He moved by night, avoiding the main roads, tracing the path toward the northern border. Every snapping twig or distant shout sent his heart hammering against his ribs.
He crossed the line into Canada, leaving his home behind to find the distance he needed to breathe. He was a man in exile, watching the border fade into the distance, knowing there was no turning back.
Canada offered refuge, but it was a quiet, restless exile. Anderson found himself in a boarding house,
pacing the floor as he contemplated the futility of his pen from across the border. Then, he met the man who would redirect the course of his life. John Brown did not walk into the room with the arrogance of a savior. He sat at the wooden table, his gaze sharp and unblinking, and he listened. When Anderson spoke of the printing press and the power of pamphlets, Brown did not mock him. He simply reached across the table and placed his hand flat against the wood. He spoke of a different kind of leverage, not the ink on the page, but the iron in the hand. Brown looked at him as a peer, not a subordinate. He spoke of the South not as a distant land, but as a battlefield. For the first time, Anderson felt the weight of his own arguments shift. He saw in the older man a mirror of his own indignation, refined into a cold, tactical resolve.
The silence in the room was heavy, filled with the sudden, sharp clarity of a decision.
Anderson stopped talking about the future. He began to listen to the plan. The ink was dry. The action had begun. The map was a sprawling, ink-stained grid of the Shenandoah Valley, weighted down at the corners by heavy iron keys. Brown spread it across the table with calloused hands, his finger tracing the winding path toward Harper's Ferry. He did not hide the vulnerabilities. He pointed to the rail lines, the river crossings, and the federal armory itself, each mark a calculated risk. Anderson leaned in, his own hand tracing the topography alongside the older man. He noted a narrow pass in the mountains, a potential bottleneck for their escape, and tapped the paper firmly. Brown looked up, his eyes meeting Anderson's, and offered a singular, sharp nod of approval. It was a bridge of trust built in the language of logistics and survival.
They spent hours hunched over the table, the candle burning low, until only a stump remained. Brown shared the names of contacts,
the stockpiles of supplies, and the exact timing of their movement.
Every detail was a secret that could mean a rope for either of them, yet they exchanged the information without hesitation.
They were no longer two men in exile. They were architects of a collapse. As the final line was drawn on the parchment, Anderson and Brown placed their hands together on the table, the weight of their pact absolute and binding. The objective was singular: the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. Brown paced the small room,
his voice low and rhythmic as he hammered out the final logistics. The plan demanded precision.
They would strike under the shroud of night, severing the telegraph wires to isolate the town before the alarm could sound. Once the doors to the armory were breached, they would distribute the pikes and rifles to every soul who stood ready to claim their freedom. Anderson listened, his mind mapping the route, calculating the distance between the armory and the surrounding plantations. The strategy was audacious, bordering on the impossible, but the logic held. By arming the enslaved population, they intended to spark a fire that would consume the institution of slavery from within. It was not merely a raid. It was the ignition of a revolution. They discussed the logistics of the retreat, the necessity of speed,
and the absolute requirement of silence. Every man in the room understood the cost of failure. There would be no middle ground.
As the final details were set, the air in the room thinned, charged with the weight of an impending storm. The plan was complete. The target was marked. The countdown to the uprising had begun. October arrived with a biting chill that clung to the damp earth. The men gathered in the shadows,
their forms barely distinguishable from the surrounding trees. Every breath was a small, white plume in the freezing air.
Anderson checked his weapon, the cold metal biting into his palms, the mechanism clicking with a sharp
finality that cut through the stillness. There was no conversation. The weight of the impending night pressed down on them,
heavier than the darkness itself. They were a collection of ghosts waiting to manifest into history. Anderson walked the perimeter of their staging area, his boots pressing silently into the soft, rain-soaked soil. He passed men sitting on crates, their heads bowed, fingers locked in tight, white-knuckled grips around their rifle stocks. None looked up. The silence was absolute, a living thing that pulsed with the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, a sound so jarring it caused a dozen men to stiffen in unison. Brown stood apart, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the town of Harper's Ferry lay hidden. He did not move. He did not blink. He simply waited. The time for deliberation had passed. Now, there was only the cold, hard reality of the coming hours.
Brown lifted a single hand. The signal, no words were spoken. The line of men detached from the shadows of the tree line and began the descent.
Anderson took his place in the column, the weight of his gear shifting rhythmically against his spine. Their boots crunched against loose shale,
a sound that seemed deafening in the hollow silence of the valley. Every man instinctively slowed his pace, eyes scanning the dark thickets for movement.
They moved as a single organism, navigating the uneven terrain by the faint, pale glow of the moon.
Halfway to the river, a sudden rustle in the brush forced the entire line to drop into the tall grass.
Anderson held his breath, his hand tight on his rifle, listening to the frantic beating of his own heart.
A deer darted across the path, its hooves clicking against the stone before fading into the night. They waited, muscles coiled, until the pulse of the forest settled once more. They rose and pushed forward, the pace quickening as the town of Harper's Ferry finally emerged as a cluster of dim, flickering lights in the distance. The air grew thick with the smell of coal smoke and damp river reeds. They were close.
The distance between them and the arsenal vanished with every stride. The final stretch lay ahead, clear and daunting.
The final barrier was a heavy wooden gate. Anderson pressed his shoulder against the timber, the wood groaning under the combined weight of the men until it gave way with a sharp, splintering crack. They surged forward, boots drumming against the hard-packed earth of the courtyard.
The watchman stood frozen for a heartbeat before scrambling away into the darkness. No shots were fired. They reached the armory doors,
the locks falling away under the force of a heavy iron pry bar. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of oil and cold steel. Anderson moved to the corner, his fingers finding the thick telegraph wires running along the wall. He gripped the heavy shears, the metal biting into the copper until the lines snapped with a resonant twang. One by one, the connections to the outside world fell silent. The town was now isolated. Brown stood in the center of the room, his eyes scanning the racks of muskets as the men fanned out to hold the windows.
The adrenaline was a sharp electric buzz in Anderson's veins. They had done it.
The federal arsenal was theirs. The silence of the night was replaced by the frantic energy of victory, and for these fleeting moments, it seemed the path ahead was clear, and the revolution was within their grasp. The triumph in the room began to sour as the minutes stretched into an hour. Brown paced the length of the armory, his eyes constantly flicking toward the narrow windows. Anderson stood by the main entrance, his rifle held across his chest, listening for the sound of boots on the street or the roar of an approaching crowd.
Nothing came. Only the wind whistled through the gaps in the stone masonry. Outside,
the town remained unnervingly still. There were no shouts of support, no surge of enslaved men breaking their chains to join the cause.
the expected tide of revolution was nothing more than a ghost.
Anderson walked to the heavy door and peered through the sliver of space between the hinges. The dark streets were empty, save for the flickering glow of a single street lamp. He pulled back, his throat tight, and locked eyes with Brown.
The realization hit them both with the force of a physical blow. The uprising had failed to ignite.
They were not the vanguard of a massive force. They were a handful of men trapped in a cold stone cage. The air in the armory felt thin, the silence heavy with the weight of their isolation.
Every shadow in the corner now looked like an enemy, and the walls that had been their fortress were rapidly becoming their tomb.
The gray light of dawn did not bring hope. It brought the enemy. Anderson was at the window when he heard it, the rhythmic thud of boots on gravel, and the metallic clatter of rifles being unslung. He pressed his face to the cold stone, watching as shadows merged into a solid line of armed men blocking the street. The local militia had arrived. They moved with a grim, practiced efficiency, taking positions behind nearby buildings and stone fences. Every exit was now covered. The armory was no longer a staging ground for revolution. It was a target. A voice boomed from the street, demanding surrender. But Brown only tightened his grip on his carbine and stepped back into the shadows of the engine house. Anderson checked his ammunition, his movements precise and mechanical. The air outside grew thick with the chatter of men organizing their lines, their voices rising in a jagged, hostile chorus. There would be no escape through the front. The militia widened their perimeter, securing the corners and cutting off the alleyways. Anderson looked at the heavy door, then at the barricaded windows. The space between them and the world outside had vanished. The defensive stand had begun, and the walls were now the only things standing between them and the swarm waiting in the morning mist. A new sound cut through the shouting outside. The rhythmic, heavy strike of a battering ram against the engine house door. It was not the militia. These men moved in unison, disciplined and silent. Marines.
Anderson gripped his rifle, his knuckles white as the heavy timber groaned under the assault.
The wood splintered, sending shards flying into the room. With a final, deafening crack, the door gave way. A cloud of white smoke billowed in, obscuring the morning light and turning the interior into a blurred landscape of gray.
Then came the roar. Gunfire erupted from both sides.
The muzzle flashes lighting the dark corners like jagged lightning. Bullets tore into the brick walls, sending chips of stone raining down. Anderson dropped low, pressing his chest against the floor to escape the leaden hail. The air turned acrid with the smell of sulfur and burnt powder, stinging his eyes and throat. Screams of men hit by the volley echoed against the high ceiling. He scrambled backward, his boots sliding on the debris-strewn floor, as the shadows of the attackers flooded the breach. The revolution had reached its violent, final conclusion, and the space between the walls was now a furnace of smoke and flame.
The roar of the opening volley died as quickly as it began, replaced by the wet, heavy silence of the wounded. Anderson pressed himself into the narrow gap behind a stack of supplies, his breathing shallow and jagged.
Through a veil of settling dust, he watched the final acts of the struggle, one by one.
The men he stood with were pulled from the shadows, their resistance broken by superior numbers. He saw Brown slumped against the brickwork, his hands pinned, his face masked in shadow and blood.
The Marines moved with cold efficiency, securing the survivors and dragging them toward the shattered doorway.
The once defiant armory was now a tomb of splintered wood and scattered iron. Anderson remained motionless,
his fingers tracing the cold floor, waiting for the focus of the soldiers to shift. The air felt thin.
Stripped of all oxygen by the spent powder, Every movement outside signaled the end. Every heavy boot step on the floorboards was a heartbeat he had to match.
He stayed in the dark, a ghost among the fallen, watching the light fade from the room as the last of his brothers were led out into the morning.
The raid was finished, the leaders were taken, and he was left in the wreckage, unseen and still breathing. The soldiers were preoccupied with the wounded, their shouts echoing against the stone walls.
Anderson waited. He forced his pulse to slow, counting the seconds between the heavy thuds of boots on the floorboards.
A Marine moved past his hiding spot, the leather of his gear creaking just inches from where Anderson knelt. He held his breath until the vibration in the floor faded. Now was the moment. He crawled, keeping his body low, belly scraping against the rough, splintered wood. He reached the rear of the engine house, where a section of the wall had collapsed during the initial fire. Through the jagged hole, he saw the alleyway, obscured by the thick, swirling haze of gunpowder. He did not rush. He checked the perimeter, watching the backs of the guards distracted by the main exit. With a final, silent push, he squeezed through the gap in the masonry. He felt the cold air hit his face. He stood, muscles tight, and merged into the gray fog of the alley. He moved with the shadows, keeping his head down and his feet silent. The soldiers were still screaming orders inside, but he was already gone, disappearing into the morning mist before anyone realized the count was wrong. The town faded behind him, replaced by the dense, unforgiving sprawl of the Virginia woods. Anderson moved with a singular purpose: stay off the roads. Every open path was a potential trap, a place where eyes could find him. He stuck to the ridge lines and the thickest brush. The terrain was brutal. Sharp rocks cut into his soles, and low-hanging branches clawed at his skin. But he did not slow down. 2 hours into his trek,
the sound of horses broke the forest silence. He dropped instantly, sliding into a narrow, muddy ravine, pressing his face into the wet leaves until his lungs burned. The patrol passed within 20 feet. He could hear the rhythmic clatter of their gear and the low, coarse voices of men searching for a ghost.
He waited until the sound died away completely before rising. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of dry leaves sounded like a shout in the stillness. He climbed higher, seeking the deepest cover. As night began to fall, he crawled into a dense thicket of pine.
He did not sleep. He lay motionless, ears straining against the dark, every shadow a threat, every gust of wind a warning of the long, dangerous miles that still stood between him and the north.
The state line was not marked by a fence or a wall, but by the change in the air. The oppressive humidity of the south broke, replaced by a cool, biting breeze that signaled he had finally crossed into the north. Anderson stumbled forward, his legs trembling from days of continuous motion. He stopped near a creek,
his knees hitting the soft earth. He looked back toward the horizon. He was the only one left. The faces of the men he had stood beside in the armory flashed in his mind, not as heroes, but as brothers who had paid the final price. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against scraps of paper he had managed to keep dry. He was alive, but the weight of the fallen rested entirely on his shoulders now.
He drank from the stream, the cold water grounding him in the present. He was no longer a fugitive running for his life. He was a witness to a failed revolution. He stood up slowly, scanning the horizon one last time before turning his back on the path he had traveled. The danger had passed, but the mission had just begun. He took a long, steady breath, feeling the stillness of the northern woods, and began the walk toward the nearest settlement, carrying the truth of Harper's Ferry with him. Survival was only the first step. The second was truth. Anderson found a small, dim room in a boarding house, clearing a space on a scarred wooden table. He bought a stack of paper and a bottle of ink.
Outside, newspapers were already circulating, painting his brothers as madmen and bloodthirsty fanatics. Anderson read the accounts and felt the heat of injustice. They were wrong. He took up the pen,
His hand was steady, guided by the memory of the armory floor and the smell of gunpowder. He did not write poetry, he wrote testimony. He mapped the sequence of the raid, the motivations of the men, and the precision of their plan. Day after day, he filled page after page, his scratchy quill the only sound in the room. He corrected every lie, refuted every rumor, and laid out the moral necessity of their cause with clinical clarity. By 1861, the manuscript was complete. A Voice from Harper's Ferry was not merely a book. It was a counterstrike. He had taken the same ink he once used to print abolitionist pamphlets and turned it into an unassailable shield for his comrades. The raid had failed in the armory, but on the page, the truth remained intact, waiting for the world to read it. History is not a static record left by generals. It is a landscape shaped by those who hold the pen. Osborne Perry Anderson understood that survival was incomplete until the truth was secured. By documenting the raid, he transformed his personal testimony into a permanent barrier against erasure. He ensured that the names and motives of his comrades were not lost to the propaganda of the time. Every page he wrote functioned as a deliberate strike against the silence that threatened to bury their sacrifices. He showed that the fight for justice requires more than the courage to act. It requires the courage to record. Generations later, researchers turned to his account to dismantle myths and reconstruct the reality of that October night. Anderson did not merely survive the collapse of the mission. He became the architect of its legacy. He proved that when the smoke clears and the battles end, the final victory belongs to those who ensure the truth remains visible. His life stands as a testament. The narrative of a nation is written by those who refuse to let the past fade. Because he wrote, they remain. Because he recorded, their struggle is preserved in the American story, unyielding and clear for all time.